So I've just watched a video which I think really reiterates a very prominent problem that we have in this country. Every country has its problems. I think one of the most pressing in the United Kingdom is job culture. Now, I've spoken about this before. It's a subject I feel very, very strongly about. And if anyone's wondering why I feel so strongly about it, that I'll come to the specific video in a minute, but just a little bit of background without going into very deep details. Me and my family once lived in a pretty rough inner city area, and we were plagued for almost 2 years relentlessly by local jobs. This involved getting our windows broken, this involved physical attacks on the street, this involved no end of abuse. Who knows why? The house physically stood out. We were new to the area. I don't know why specifically we were targeted. No doubt those factors contributed to it. But the point is we were targeted. Now I that was 15 years ago, 16 years ago, actually 17 years ago now. I haven't forgotten how much of an impact that had on my life. The mental anguish it caused, which is a point that's often overlooked when we're talking about what victims go through. The mental anguish, the stress, and the anxiety. Literally thinking every time you go out of your house, am I going to be attacked? It's a very unpleasant thing, and I know that there are many people across this country going through that right now, and it's sickening. So this particular video, it's in Bradford, in a public square. I believe it's Forster Square. I've only been to Bradford once, but I believe the big public square there is called Forster Square. And there's a fountain, and some teenage boys are attacking another lad. It's pretty obvious they're trying to get his bike. So they beat him to the ground, kick him repeatedly on the head. This is all in broad daylight, very much in public, in a city centre. And it's bad enough this happens anywhere, but it shows the audacity of criminals to do this in broad daylight in the city centre. So there's a lot of things. Incidentally, there's a security guard there, and he seems to remonstrate with them, and he seems to do something on his phone, but not much else. I think he could have done more. Um, he's a big guy. He could have pulled them off or tried something. Okay, maybe they would have attacked him as well, but frankly, that's his job. What's the point of being a security man if you're not going to have the courage to physically intervene? I think that was pretty disgraceful. But, we're not talking about a dark alley at night time. We're talking about broad daylight. That's how audacious these jobs have become. And it is a problem across the country. So there is multiple angles to look at. Firstly, there will be always those who try to enable criminals and come out with excuses. Oh, it's poverty. It's poverty that causes it. I think that attitude is insulting to people on a lower income because it's insinuating they're all potential criminals. I would say that's sort of an elitist comment, actually. Um, Look, there are certainly factors that cause this sort of behaviour, but I have no sympathy and no patience with those who go out of their way to try and cast such scumbags in a sympathetic light. The only normal response to this should be outrage. I mean, these people are bullies, that's what they are. It's bad enough if it was one of them attacking them, but why do they always do it in packs? Because they are nothing but scum. They are nothing but cards. And, I contacted the Sentencing Council of England and Wales recently. They're the body in Westminster who are influential in setting sentencing guidelines. Now, they alone don't they're not responsible for every single sentence that is passed, but they are pretty influential in terms of setting the guidelines. I also believe that weak judges are part of the problem. because time and time again we get very serious offences where some useless judge doesn't issue the maximum sentence that's available. And I believe that should be the case for particularly gratuitous crimes involving clear physical violence. This particular crime, because I've personally been on the receiving end of it, um, I find particularly disturbing. Um, and they're kicking him on the head. That could cause a serious head injury. It could cause brain damage if it was sustained long enough, if it was hard enough. So the footage is very clear. I hope the police are taking action, but more importantly, I hope that when this comes to trial, some useless judge doesn't give them a meaningless community sentence. And I do consider a community sentence in this sort of case to be utterly pointless. Such job, I mean, if they're going to do that in broad daylight, do you really think that they will take a community sentence seriously? I think community sentencing has its place. I think it should be for first time offenders and for genuinely non violent crime. But the only way this situation is going to change in this country is if there is enough public outrage. Every time we see these things, it's like, oh, it's terrible, and people are angry, but we go back to kind of as a society accepting it. I think the regressive left have a lot to answer for. I'm not talking about everyone on the left, but the likes of the Green Party absolutely infuriate me with their stupidity because they are anti justice. Every single time the Greens talk about crime, it's about understanding the criminal. It's about, oh, let's not focus on punishment. They treat it like it's some sort of dispute, and they're too stupid to see that this sort of bullying, vicious behaviour must result. Justice isn't about revenge. It infuriates me when people say, oh, you just want revenge by sending them to prison. Screw your head on right. Any idiot that says prison is revenge, they aren't living in the real world. Prison is not revenge, it's justice. And yes, I'm well aware that there is a serious problem going on in prisons. Prisons are overcrowded. You could say it's a crisis. So I really do think that there needs to be a serious, serious discussion about building more prisons. Think about it. Building more prisons eases the pressure on inmates, which means more humane conditions. It eases the pressure on staff. And as a result, ostensibly that would reduce reoffending. I know there's other factors as well, but I think it would help. Yes, it would be expensive, and yes, it would be controversial because people will say, oh, we don't want to live next to a prison. But the utilitarian question is, well, do we continue allowing this situation where they go to prison and reoffending occurs and this situation continues where the public get terrorized by yobs? We need a legal system that scares criminals, that is so harsh that it scares them. Being harsh doesn't mean taking away human rights. They'll still have due process, they'll still have food, they'll still have exercise. But we need a system that really, for once, puts victims first. I contacted the Sentencing Council of England and Wales, like I said, and they came back with a very pathetic bureaucratic response. It was a non response. But one thing that was notable, the guy said that they have 12 officers. One of them, 1 out of 12, is responsible for victim liaison, for representing victims. 1 out of 12. That means the other 11, presumably, must be responsible for representing criminals. Or even if that's not the case, certainly not representing victims. That is an absolute travesty, but I think it tells you everything you need to know. I try to get on with my life. I try to be assertive when I think there's going to be trouble. I try to move on. I try to avoid those sort of situations. But Because of my previous experience, I know what yobs are capable of. These are people who are depraved. They don't think twice about physically attacking total strangers. And until, as a nation, we say you're not going to be tolerated, this situation is going to continue. So I do think people will say, oh, you're being partisan. Well, unfortunately, it is predominantly the left, and I don't think it's everyone on the left, but it's predominantly the left that predictably enable criminals by coming up with excuses, by being anti justice, by saying that prison is revenge. Screw your head on right. It's not revenge, it's justice. If you cannot see that a violent or unprovoked attack should result in something more than a tap on the wrist, then there's something seriously wrong with you. I mean, put it this way, would you say to a kid being bullied in school that, oh, you should forgive those who are doing it? Or you should, maybe they would. Thank God that the Green Party don't have more power, because I've looked at their manifesto and their entire ideology is based on criminal enabling, and it's pretty reprehensible. I'm centre left on a number of issues, but I freely admit when it comes to crime, I'm socially very conservative. That doesn't mean, flog 'em and hang 'em. No, I know that punishment alone is not the only way to deal with this. I get that. But what the regressive left need to understand, the punishment does have a place. That documentary I watched recently on the serial killer in Sunderland, um, one of the victim's relatives, I believe it was a sister, just to be clear, this was a man, Stephen Greaveson, who murdered four young lads in Sunderland in the early 90s. I believe she said something like, thank goodness he is in jail. And she sleeps better knowing that. So jail isn't fickle, it has a purpose. Okay, it may not bring back loved ones, but at least it shows the loved ones that the perpetrators of these evil acts are not walking free to do it to someone else. That's what these anti prison extremists need to understand. I mean, if you put it to them, do you really believe that arsonists, rapists, child killers, and gangs who viciously attack an individual should walk free? They'll probably say, oh no, I don't believe that. But when you really push them, they are against prison, full stop. They never say, oh, but I do concede that prison is needed for this. They never say that. So they are anti prison extremists. And they need to be called out for it because they're part of the problem, because they campaign for leniency. And there's other professions that, because of the work they do, they have a tendency to be sympathetic to offenders. I would say youth workers. And, not to bash them, they do a difficult job. But there are certain people in certain industries that they need to understand that the majority of the public want to see justice. And I sympathize with police who often work hard, not always. Police can certainly be um, guilty of incompetence as well. My goodness, there's plenty of examples. But I do sympathize with the police. When they work really hard to get someone, then it goes before a judge, and some useless judge gives them a tap on the wrist. I'm not attacking every single judge in this country, but we do have too many examples of serious violent crimes resulting in non custodial sentence. Whenever a crime involves violence, it should automatically be a custodial sentence. Automatically. David Gauck says he wants to reduce the number of short term prison stays. Well, my question for David Gauck would be okay, so the only alternative is community sentencing. What do you say to long suffering shopkeepers? What do you say to people who may take, for example, I mean, we tend to trivialize non-violent crime. Let's say you have a pensioner and he or she has been robbed of their life savings. That may not involve violence, but it is a destructive, wicked crime. My question for David Gauck, what punishment do you propose? I don't have much respect for him as a justice secretary. I think he's a weak justice secretary because he is against justice. I mean, you have a justice secretary who is against prison, and prison is part of justice. You cannot be anti prison and say you are for justice. I heard rumours that he was one of three Tory MPs, ministers who were going to resign. I mean, that's to do with Brexit issues, but frankly, I'd like to see the back of David Gauke. I don't have much respect for him. This is a man who said that violent women shouldn't go to prison. He's a weak Justice Secretary, and he personifies a weak system in this country. Now, some will dismiss me as a right wing blowhard. Like I say, on this issue, I'm right wing, so be it. I'll call a spade a spade. I am conservative. On other issues, I'm centre left. But when it comes to crime, I believe very firmly in the simple principle of fairness. That's what justice is, fundamentally. It's simple, pure fairness. So if your response to a violent crime is oh prison doesn't work, I would suggest you need to look at yourself in the mirror and think, whose side am I on? Am I on the side of people being tormented by criminals, or am I on the side of criminals? And I'll leave it there. Incidentally, if you were in Bradford when this attack happened and you saw it, please do the right thing. Go to the police with any information you have. It may be that they've already got that information, but just do the right thing. You know, this young lad was being attacked repeatedly on the head. He could have got serious brain damage. And the fact of the matter is, they were doing it in broad daylight, indicating that they've got no fear. And that is the problem. It's a culture that we need to change. It's this desensitized culture of it's scary. So please, if you were in Bradford, do the right thing and go to the police with information. You could do it anonymously. Just do the right thing. I'll leave it there. We need a revolution in this country. We need a peaceful revolution that will finally make sure that justice is instilled because far too often it just doesn't happen.